Canadian researchers say cooking oil may be the key to helping prevent the spread of foodborne bacteria such as Salmonella, Listeria and E. coli. They say many foods produced on an industrial scale include raw ingredients that are mixed together in large stainless steel machines that can be difficult to clean. In a study published in the journal ACS Applied Materials and Interfaces, the engineering researchers say the surfaces of the machines get minute scratches and grooves that are ideal hiding places for bacteria. Professor Ben Hatton, Drive. Dalal Asker and Drive. Tarek Awada of the University of Toronto say their research indicates a thin layer of cooking oil fills in the microscopic scrapes, forming an effective barrier to bacterial attachment. They say this minimizes the risk of cross-contamination, which can lead to foodborne disease. Hatton says they found their system reduced bacterial levels inside the machines they tested between 1,000 and 100,000 times. The researchers collaborated on the project with Agri-Neo, an Ontario seed processing company looking for a solution to bacterial contamination. The process involves treating the stainless steel to make it hydrophobic, so it repels water, which allows the oil to stick to the surface, Hatton said. However, he noted that the oil on the surface will be worn away as the machine operates. The focus of the paper was to see if we take this food safe, really cheap, everyday oil and kind of trap it at the surface, and then look at what happens when you wear it away. Is it still effective? Hatton said. The study shows it is still effective because it fills in the grooves and scratches, which are the main problem sites in the machines, he said. Hatton said they have tested the process only in the lab and don't know if it can be applied for industrial use. But we're definitely interested in trying to do a scaled-up test of this for real equipment. The researchers tried to keep the process as simple, cheap and scalable as possible, he said, noting there's the economic cost of an outbreak that shuts down a whole line and recalls and liability. He said they had not yet followed up with Agri-Neo and were also considering reaching out to other food companies to see if they were interested in testing their process. Health Canada has said Salmonella is the leading cause of bacterial foodborne illness in the country, with more than 200,000 cases in 2015 alone. Canada has been deliberately left on the sidelines of NAFTA talks, President Donald Trump suggested Thursday, exactly 1 year after talks first began on overhauling the trilateral trade agreement. Mexico and the United States began holding 111 talks on July 26 without Canada present. The two governments have voiced hopes that renegotiating the North American Free Trade Agreement could conclude before the end of August. In recent months, Washington has hit Mexico, Canada and other traditional U.S. trade allies with billions of dollars in punitive measures on steel, aluminum and other products. From corporate giants to small businesses, American companies are feeling the pinch from Mr. Trump's global trade war, The Globe and Mail's Adrian Morrow reports. The 1994 agreement, an expanded version of a Canada-U.S. free trade deal from 1988, created what was then the biggest free trade area in the world. It removed barriers to the flow of goods and labor between Canada, the United States and Mexico, under the oversight of an independent dispute settlement process. Canada, the world's largest purchaser of U.S. goods, saw its exports to U.S. markets soar. The Americans are less dependent on NAFTA than Canada is, The Globe's Stephen Chase explains. Trevor Tombe, a University of Calgary economist, calculates that there are only 2 American states, Michigan and Vermont, where trade with Canada exceeds 10% of their annual economic output. What has NAFTA done for us? 4 reviews from 3 countries. The politics of free trade have undergone a remarkable U-turn since NAFTA, and the FTA before it, came into being. In 1988, Canada had a progressive conservative Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney, who fought an election over the Canada-US trade deal with the Liberals opposing it. He also had pro-free trade Republican allies in the White House, with Ronald Reagan and later George H.W. Bush, backing him up. Contrast that with 2016, when protectionism turned into a defining theme of the U.S. election. Both presidential candidates opposed the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a trade deal even bigger than NAFTA, but the Republican Mr. Trump also singled out NAFTA and promised to erect a wall along the U.S.-Mexico border. In his inauguration speech, Mr. Trump promised an America-first attitude to trade, immigration and foreign affairs. In its initial months, Mr. Trump's inner circle strongly disagreed about what demands to make in NAFTA renegotiations. There was a moderate camp, including Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin and Mr. Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner, that wanted to enhance NAFTA and make cross-border business easier for corporations, and a protectionist camp, including former chief strategist Stephen Bannon. The protectionist camp has been more dominant in recent months, especially since the March departure of economic advisor Gary Cohn. Out of that conversation came an initial list of 100 broad, sometimes vaguely worded demands that the U.S. Trade Representative's office released in July 2017. Some highlights include reducing the U.S. trade deficit within NAFTA, which could mean increasing U.S. exports or reducing Canadian and Mexican imports. Scrapping NAFTA's dispute resolution panels, which have sometimes ruled in Canada's favor on softwood lumber and other trade issues. Using Buy American provisions to bar Canadian or Mexican firms from seeking U.S. government contracts. Making Canadian and Mexican intellectual property rules more similar to that found in U.S. law. The Trump administration's most contentious NAFTA demands began to take shape at the fourth round of talks in Arlington, Virginia. Demands include dairy. The U.S. wants an end to Canada's supply management regime for dairy and poultry products. Sunset clause. The U.S. wants the new NAFTA to expire in 5 years unless the member countries agree to renew it. The Trump administration has tried to gain leverage in the NAFTA talks with heavy tariffs on steel and aluminum. On March 8, Mr. Trump introduced tariffs of 25% and 10%, respectively, on the two metals, citing the need to protect domestic supply of the metals for U.S. military needs. At the time, Canada and Mexico were exempted, but Mr. Trump explicitly linked that exemption to NAFTA. If we're making a deal on NAFTA, this will figure into the deal and we won't have the tariffs on Canada or on Mexico. I have a feeling we're going to make a deal on NAFTA. Months later, with no NAFTA deal in sight, the U.S. Commerce Secretary hit Canada and Mexico, as well as the European Union, with the tariffs after all, saying NAFTA talks were progressing too slowly for the Trump administration's liking. Mexico and Canada retaliated with tariffs of their own. Canada's tariffs target $16.6 billion in U.S. imports, not just steel and aluminum, starting July 1. The full list of products includes food products, whiskey, candy, cucumbers and gherkins, pizza, quiche, household products and furniture, mattresses, sleeping bags, playing cards, ballpoint pens, wood and paper products, toilet paper, certain types of plywood, paper and paperboard, vehicles, sailboats and motorboats. Canadian uranium could be the next metal in the U.S. administration's crosshairs. On July 18, Mr. Trump's Commerce Secretary announced an investigation of uranium exports because of national security concerns. Building barriers, both physical and economic, with Mexico has been Mr. Trump's stated goal since he began running for president. In the 2015 speech announcing his campaign, the one where he said rapists and criminals were coming across the U.S.-Mexico border, he said Mexicans were laughing at us and killing us economically. Mr. Trump's election put Mexico's then-president, Enrique Peña Nieto, in a tight spot. He faced domestic pressure to stand up to Washington about the wall that Mr. Trump wants Mexico to pay for, which Mexico refuses to do. But he also had to avoid alienating a major trading partner and being shut out of the new North American trade regime. In July, Mr. Peña Nieto's dilemma passed on to Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who won a landslide victory in July 1's presidential election. The leftist leader, popularly known as AMLO from his initials, promised to avoid fighting with Mr. Trump and keep NAFTA as a bilateral agreement with Canada if the United States pulls out of it. Mr. López Obrador is officially sworn in as president in December. For Mexico, the biggest issue of the NAFTA talks is auto manufacturing. The United States wants new requirements that 40 to 45% of auto content in the NAFTA zone be made at factories that pay $15 an hour or more, which is more than 4 times what the average Mexican worker makes. Mexico's resistance to the auto proposal, which they fear would drive manufacturing jobs away from the country, has kept the NAFTA negotiators at loggerheads. However, since Mexico and the U.S. entered one-on-one talks in late July, Mexico said it's eyeing a NAFTA breakthrough on auto rules. Mexico, along with Canada, has been targeted by the Trump administration with heavy tariffs on steel and aluminum. In retaliation, Mexico raised tariffs on products made in pro-Trump heartland states, such as steel, pork, fruit and cheese. Dairy supply management. Canada's dairy, egg and poultry industries are governed by a supply management system that dates back to the